Present my screen again here. All right. Nikki, can we all see that?
Yep, you're on.
Okay, perfect. All right, so Joseph Spierer, I have presented here before. This is the first time virtually, so this is very exciting. What it is that I wanted to talk to everyone about today is a little bit about construction costs. So let's see why this isn't moving. There we go. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about our firm. So our firm is a high-end custom residential single-family architecture firm. That constitutes probably about, I would say, 70% of our work. The other 30% of our work has to do with multifamily and commercial. We're and mixed use. We're designing a mixed use complex in Torrance at the moment. We also consult a great deal, especially for realtors. So we spend a good deal of time talking to realtors on the phone and consulting in order to give them architectural advice, which can be an important thing to do during the contingency period of any escrow. Especially if your clients are planning on adding on, or if they're planning on demolishing and starting from scratch, or even if they just want to know what they can put on a vacant lot. That's the kind of thing that we consult on. What you're seeing right now is just some of our newest technology, which if there's time, I can show you guys a little bit more thoroughly at the end of the process. All right, so let's talk briefly about construction costs. We're going to talk about remodels, additions, new construction, but mostly we're going to be talking about common misconceptions and things to watch out for. So let's get started. So what you have in this hypothetical here is you have imagine for a moment that you're driving around with one of your clients, and what they want is a 3,000 square foot home, but they have this grand plan. What they really want to do is they want to start with a 1,500 square foot home. They said, okay, thank you for finding this 1,500 square foot home for me, built in 1970. What my plan is to add in 1,500 square feet right on top of that existing 1,500 square foot home. I'm going to basically cover all of that square footage, and I have all the costs figured out. I figured out that I'm going to spend $300 per foot for construction, and that in the end, it's going to be $450,000, because I'm going to be multiplying the $300 per square foot times the 1,500 square feet, which gives me what I think is going to be my addition cost. To which you say, oh my God, you need to consult with an architect. And the reason is because you're adding new on top of old. So what you have is you have a foundation issue. You have an old foundation that was meant for a 1,500 square foot home. You have a structure in the first floor. All of those beams and columns, they are all meant for a single-story house built in the 1970s. So you're going to have floor framing issues. You're going to have finishes, because basically, in order to support a second story on top of that first story, you have to do a great deal of structural connections. So you end up having to take the entire thing down to studs and reinforce the foundation in order to add on to that second floor. You also have asbestos and mold, and then you have other hidden conditions, right? I just tacked on another $100,000 for things that we don't know that we don't know. So here's more the reality of what that addition would look like. What you have is maybe for the second story is way more expensive, because again, you're connecting new to old, so it might be $450 per foot, and then the bottom floor is old. And so you need to apply about $400 per foot. And keep in mind, these are all very general numbers, and they can vary wildly based on circumstances, foundation, level of finish, soils, all sorts of things. But this is kind of your average, for most areas of the South Bay. So here's the reality, right? They were planning on $450,000, and what ended up happening is they ended up spending $1.4 million to do a 1,500 square foot addition. And so they're very disappointed because they had severely underestimated what it was that it would take. So here's what I would say instead is a better idea. If you have a lot that has a 1,500 square foot old house on it, it's better if you're planning on adding the same amount of square footage up above that's down below. It might make more sense to just knock the entire thing down and start from scratch, because then you save a bit of money on your second story. You save a bit of money on your first story. You get to start from the beginning instead of performing surgery on the foundation from a demolition standpoint. You are just starting from scratch, and you get to pour new, right? So demo takes a few days as opposed to months in order to make that happen properly, or at least weeks. So here's what it would cost if you did this instead of adding on to the second story. So you can see it's actually less money at this point. So why is that? Why does it happen that way? And the reality is, this is the way that we kind of think of new construction is much different than the way we think about doing an addition or a remodel. This is a very simple graph, and it's very simple for new construction. The larger the project, the more it costs. Again, larger the project, the more it costs. It's very, very easy, very simple. But the curve is a little bit different for a remodel or an addition. For a remodel or addition, it doesn't make sense to tear the house down if you're adding on a bedroom onto the side of the house, or if you're adding on a bathroom or something like that. But at some point, you do end up reaching a point of no return. You end up, and this is from the previous slide, right? So essentially, once you kind of pass that flex point, you end up spending more money trying to save the existing project than you do to just tear it down and start from scratch. And I can't tell you the number of projects that I drive past where I say, you know what, that one definitely, they spent more than they would have if they had started over entirely. All right, so, I showed you some construction costs, and I showed you, I think I pointed out $400 a foot. That doesn't mean you have to build for $400 a foot. You can build for less, but the product that you get is significantly different. So right here, what you see is you see tract construction. So, homes can be built for $250 a foot, but it's production housing. You build 50 houses at once, and you can spend $250 a foot. Also, it's hard. I know I put Torrance in parts of Los Angeles, but it is still very difficult in the greater Los Angeles area, even if you're doing tract housing, to hit this price per foot at this point. Costs have just skyrocketed. So, here's a project, and by the way, this is not a project that we did. This is not a project that we put together, but this one is. So we actually designed this one in Manhattan Beach. This is kind of an entry level price per square foot for the beach areas. So if you're building in Manhattan Beach, you just kind of have to expect that you're spending $400 a foot. Yes, you can spend $350 a foot, but $400 a foot is probably a better entry level amount to expect. Now you still get very simple finishes. So you can see this kitchen is small and simple, and then you do have some potential for some accents, like maybe a folding door that opens entirely and creates this great indoor-outdoor feel. But it's still relatively simple architecture for $400 a foot. Then, of course, there's anywhere in between. This is showing $800 a foot. This is another project that we did. This one's in the Palisades. And the things that kind of drive up the price are things like, molding detailing that you see here above the stove, or the kind of intricate shape on the nosing on the countertop, the eased edge that you see, different fixtures and maybe appliances, and how big are your openings, and let's say, do you have brick on your, this is real brick here, do you have brick on your ceiling? Those types of things really drive up cost and can make it so you end up hitting this price per square foot that we're seeing right here, right? We have a project on Rocky Point in PVE right now, which is going to be at the $1,200 per square foot mark. And then we have everywhere in between. We have, most of our projects are probably around anywhere between $500 and $600 a foot. And that still is considered high-end residential. And it's, average price per square foot in the South Bay right now is about $500 per foot. It's about average. By the way, if you guys want to submit questions during this process, please feel free. I can even unmute you here temporarily to allow you to talk if you wanted to ask a question. But there is actually a question answer forum, which is easier for me to see. If you submit them there, I will answer them. I'll take some breaks here and answer questions in between. And then again, at the end, I'll answer some questions as well. So feel free to do that. All right, so you might say that there is, I now understand how much it costs to build a home, and the reality is it's not just hard costs. And if you're talking to contractors and they've given you quotes and things, it's not the full picture of what it is that it's going to cost you to do something, because you have soft costs, and soft costs include architect and, basically you have architect and, and then you have all the different engineers and potentially designers and things like that. So this is just kind of a general example of what you could expect for that same 3,000 square foot home we were looking at earlier. The architect, they're kind of like snowflakes. You can talk to 1,000 different architects, and you're going to get 1,000 different prices, and they're all different, and they all offer different products. So, an architect might do, you might spend $20,000 for a 3,000 square foot house, but the product that you're going to get is going to be very different. It's not that it's a bad product, but maybe they're not giving you visualization. Maybe it's just kind of, they say, okay, you get one design and it's my design, and I'm just going to submit it for you, and then that's the end of it, right? And then on the high end, on the extremely high end, you might spend $200,000 for this same 3,000 square foot home. And then again, everywhere in between. So it all just depends. Let me see, I have a question here. From Dave Sparling, Joe, are these costs for new and remodel construction? And the answer is, these are for new construction. So basically what I'm showing here is for new construction. Even the construction costs I showed you before are also for new construction. If you're doing an interior remodel, if you're kind of moving all the walls around on the inside and you're not touching the outside, you might spend $250 a foot. If you are doing inside and outside work, then you're starting to get up to the point where you have to consider tearing the wing off and starting from scratch in order to get those benefits, because then you're up at $350 a foot or $400 a foot. And then the question is, are we close enough in order to warrant tearing that portion of the house down? And then Sandy here says, does the cost per square foot include developer and permit fees? And I think I'm answering that right now. So no, it does not. It does not include that. So okay, great. So you essentially have these soft costs, right? So the structural engineer, they are they're one of the most important pieces of this puzzle. They determine how much steel goes on inside of your home. And how much, what kind of structure and what kind of foundation. And a good engineer can kind of minimize the amount of structure and maximize the strength, whereas maybe a novice engineer will accidentally over-engineer something, and they'll create you know, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost money that just goes straight into the ground, literally straight into the ground. And then you have a civil engineer. They're an important piece of this puzzle too, because they help create the site drainage. They help to drain the site away from the building so that you don't get water infiltration, which I know you guys see a lot during inspection. You see, and that all boils down to bad civil engineering. If the civil engineering was done properly, there wouldn't be any real chance for water to come into the home because the site would have been drained properly, and you wouldn't have had that issue. Then you have soils engineer, and this one's a good one to consult with on some of those hillside homes, you know. So I was telling you about that Rocky Point home that's right there on the cliff. If we hadn't consulted with a soils engineer at that beginning of that process, we would not have known what type of soil we're dealing with, and therefore we would not have known that we needed 120-foot deep caissons, that's concrete and steel, straight into the ground. That's 120 feet, that's you know, 12 stories under the ground to hold up a single-story house. Client wanted it badly, so we ended up, you know, they ended up closing anyway and moving forward. But if they had known that they were pouring $2 million straight into the earth, I'm saying if they didn't know that and they got that as a surprise later, that would have been very difficult for them. But they, you know, this way they understood what they were getting into at the beginning. It protects everyone involved. And then you have the surveyor. You know, they figure out your lot lines, your boundaries, and you have Title 24 energy consultant. They figure out the embodied energy of your building. You know, how much, you know, what will solar panels help you achieve that energy that's required by law? Or can you have this much glass? Or is the law not going to allow you to do that because of energy reasons? What type of insulation you're going to need, etc. And then plan check fees and permit fees. And then of course you have other. So here at the bottom here, you can see, you know, typically you might budget $40 per foot for soft costs, but it could be higher, and you really never know until you start talking to your architect and start asking them questions, what your soft costs are going to be overall. Because here are some other potentials, right? You might even have an elevator consultant if you need to have something that's different, that's special. You know, we had a pneumatic elevator that we installed in one of our projects, which is, you know, the elevator cab itself floats on a cushion of air up to the different floors instead of having cables or a piston underneath. It just kind of floats there in a clear tube, you know, and that kind of thing requires a different level of consulting. So then you have permitting. So let's talk about permitting in some of these different cities here and what that means. So so let's talk about city fees. Let's start there. So you have planning costs, the cost that it takes to submit to the planning department. You have building and safety costs. So, and again, the planning department, they help you figure out the bulk and the mass of the building, and they make sure that you are not going over any of that. The building department, they help you figure out how this is going to be you know, constructed, and they will actually tell you if you need more or less structure. And then a homeowners association, right? PV, you have the art jury, they're the HOA there. And then at Rolling Hills, you have the architectural committee. I'm on that one, so I review everything that goes through there. And you know, every one of these departments, they need their own fee in order to review these things and in order to give you corrections and extend the process. All right, so then you have, you know, you have the different phases of architecture, right? So just real quick on that, you know, you start with pre-design, and this is the phase that most real estate agents are most concerned with, because pre-design is the kind of the escrow phase, right? It's the phase during the contingency period and during escrow, when we can help you figure out what it is that needs to take place. Do we have a, you know, do we have any sort of soils issue, or do we have a, you know, whatever the issues are, we help you uncover that at the beginning of the phase. I mean, at the beginning of the process. And then all these other phases occur usually after the close of escrow or once all the contingencies are removed, we might start schematic design. That's the pretty picture phase, right? That was kind of what I was showing you earlier with that 3D rendering. That's schematic design where we figure out floor plan and design and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And then design development, this is where we start to add all the detail in the plans. How is this particular element going to come together with this particular element? That's when we start to figure that out. And when we start to negotiate with the city and with all those other agencies that I was showing you. And then that bleeds into construction documents where we put together all the documents for the contractor. And then construction administration is where we stick around during construction to make sure that everything gets built according to plan. The last thing you want is to spend a bunch of money with an architect and engineers to put together this great amount of detail into these plans, only for the contractor not to understand it or to not ask the right questions during construction. So that's why we like to stick around during construction for construction administration. So rules, codes, and regulations. There are tons of rules. They are never ending. I mean, I have to tell you, when we look at the building code, which, I was talking to a 83-year-old friend of mine who is an architect, and he was telling me that the building code used to be a pamphlet. And today it takes up an entire wall of our library. It's 15 volumes and growing. And I mean, these are massive books. Each of these are massive books. So just tons and tons of rules, and everyone layers rules, and whatever's the most strict takes precedence. And the city might have rules, and the state has rules, and then you have national rules like ADA for public buildings and stuff like that. And you have to pay attention to all of them, and they all affect you, right? And so it's all very complicated. And in order to maximize what you can do, and in order to not make mistakes throughout the process, this has to be really assessed very carefully because there are always surprises. But do you have this many surprises, or do you have this many surprises? And if you can keep it to this level, then the cost and the time ramifications remain low. And they all vary. They vary from city to city and overlay to overlay. And then from case to case, but my favorite is from time to time, because that means that each individual person who is behind the counter reviewing these drawings gets to make their own decision in a gray area situation. And so even if you think that you have a correct answer, it may not be correct tomorrow. And we've had situations where we started with one plan checker, and then our client put our project on hold for a year or 2 years because of one reason or another. And then we come back and it's a different plan checker, and the things that they told us that we could do have changed. Even though the code hasn't changed, their opinion has changed on interpretation of that code. So let's talk about kind of some specific areas, because it's kind of interesting. And if you guys want to flood me with more questions now at this point, go ahead and start asking more questions, and then I'll get to them after this section here. What we have here is we have the Los Angeles Baseline Mansionization area. And they actually just recently changed their rules. They are kind of anti-mansion up there. So some of those big homes that have been created, you could never do that again today. You essentially have kind of strict rules becoming more strict. So then, let's look at LA Baseline Mansionization. So you have, let's say, for example, this is one home that we did in the Palisades. And what you have here is you have a walkout basement, right? So you have a walkout basement, which all counts towards the square footage of the home. You have, because it's kind of open to air. So it all counts towards the square footage of the home. So if you wanted to kind of maximize, what you'd have to do is use bonus square footage, which is shown here in green, which does not count, right? And this does not count towards your overall square footage because it's completely buried and cannot be seen and doesn't add to the element of mansionization from a visual standpoint. And so they allow you to have more square footage underneath the home. Some people might not kind of think about that while they're putting a design together. And then as far as how long it takes to get a permit in LA, it's still 10 to 14 months for design and a permit, which is a long time, but LA takes a long time to permit things. And yes, that can be shorter. It can be 6 or 7 months, but you can't expect it. Depending on what you're doing, you kind of have to expect the long and then be pleasantly surprised when it's less. And then you have, Santa Monica. This is a situation here. We had an apartment complex that we designed up there, and we had followed all of their architectural guidelines and everything, but apparently they were trying to make this area historical, but without telling anyone. And so we hit some snags with the architectural review board, but we ended up basically we ended up hiring a lawyer and telling them, you can't do this, you can't stop our project because you plan on making something historical that's not historical, and we ended up getting it through. Here's that project I showed you before in Manhattan Beach. So Manhattan Beach, I think, is very easy to work with because there is no design review committee. And in most areas of Manhattan Beach, there is no homeowners association. So when you are working with Manhattan Beach, it's very simple. As long as you follow the rules, you can do what you want. There is a height limit, and you can see that's kind of defined by these dashed lines. There's setbacks, and as long as you stay within that envelope that is predetermined for you in Manhattan Beach, you can do whatever you want, as can be seen by that pink emoji house that still is pink and has not been converted back. You really can do whatever it is that you want to do from an aesthetic standpoint and from a size standpoint, as long as it fits within those written parameters. So complicated but clear rules that have to be followed, but no neighbor can tell you not to do something. Then and it's relatively quick. Manhattan Beach, 7 to 12 months for design and permit, 2 or 3 months for design, depending on the complexity of what we're doing, and then the rest for permitting. Then you have Rolling Hills, which is kind of, it's not too bad to get a permit in Rolling Hills, as long as, again, you follow the rules. The rules are a bit more strict, right? Rolling Hills, you can only do a 1-story white ranch home. There are 3 types of ranch styles that you can do back there, but it still has to be a ranch style home. The top one is Modern Ranch, one that we designed, and the bottom one is what's called Early California Ranch. But you can see it's still ranch style. You can still do something beautiful. It doesn't have to look like all of the homes that you see back there that are traditional ranch. You can do something more interesting, but it still has to be 1-story ranch. Hermosa Beach is kind of like Manhattan in that it kind of has to fit a style, but it's the public staff that's looking at it, so they're not really looking too closely at style. And it has clear rules, pretty fast permitting process, unless you're doing coastal. If you have if you're in the coastal zone in Hermosa Beach, then that process can be extended and it can be a bit more difficult. But still easier than I think what we're about to look at next, which is Palos Verdes Estates. Palos Verdes Estates has an art jury, so they have that HOA, that extra layer that adds on months. You have that planning commission. And the planning commission, during the planning commission meeting, you can have a planning commissioner or even a neighbor that says your house is too tall, you need to lower it. Even if you have complied with all of the height, width, size rules, it is not a guarantee. And in fact, it is unlikely that your first submittal will be accepted. The likelihood is that whatever you submit with, if you submit with something like this big, it's going to be this big. If you submit something this big, it's going to be this big. And it's just the nature of Palos Verdes Estates and how the negotiation process works back there. They like to see compromise no matter where you start if a neighbor objects, which is almost every time. For example, Palos Verdes Estates. This is a view of our client's home from, this picture was taken from an objecting neighbor's home. This was 3 streets back, and our home, I don't know if you can see the flag, but you can barely see the flag. It's like way there in the corner, and it's barely popping up, and you can see a bit more flag over here. Yeah, there you go. It's not up here, it's over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's a little bit of flag that you can kind of see there, and it is, you know, they're saying that it's blocking their view. So this neighbor actually objected because they say, you know, it's blocking a little bit of their greenery, even though you can see what their panoramic view looks like. And believe it or not, the Planning Commission took this to heart, and they made us lower the building a little bit. So amazing, but it is just part of the process. There's also, you know, if you're proposing a home, it's not just about blocking view, because, you know, even if your view is out to the right over here, if your neighbor feels like you're kind of imposing on them or looking down into their yard, they also have the ability to object. All right, so that's about it. That's everything that I have at the moment. I don't see any other open questions here. So if anybody has any questions at this point, please feel free. Oh, I see a raised hand. So I'm going to, it looks like.
If you're raising your hand, you'll just need to put your question in the Q&A so that Joe can see what
you know what, Nikki, it looks like I can allow them to talk. Do you mind if I do that?
You're gonna bring them into the class?
Well, there's an allow to talk button, and then they can ask their question, and then I can.
Sure.
Oh, you know what? It looks like Serbi, am I pronouncing that right? Serbi? Looks like is asking, how much does it cost for hardscaping? How much does it cost for hardscaping? Hardscaping varies a great deal, right? So it really comes down to the cost of whatever material, right? If you're using concrete, then it can be a few dollars per foot. If you are using, stone, then it can range. I mean, you can have a $4 a foot stone. You can also have a $50 a foot stone. And it just kind of depends. So there's everywhere in between. So I hope that answers that question. Let's see. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, here we go. There's another one. In Rancho Palos Verdes, what type of permits are needed for hardscaping? So in Rancho Palos Verdes, you do need to submit, it's called a landscape, even though it's hardscaping, you still do need to submit a landscaping plan. And the reason is because they have a lot coverage maximum in Rancho Palos Verdes. It's one of the few areas that actually cares how much of your lot you're covering. So if you're putting a bunch of hardscape, it all counts towards your landscape, towards your hardscape coverage, and you have to instead put in more landscape if it takes up too much of the land. So you are limited in how much hardscape that you can put. So you do have to submit a landscape plan that has calculations that shows what your total lot area is, and therefore what percentage you are covering. From Dwight, I see, what is cost advantage of leaving one wall standing during a remodel with any city? So I get this question a lot. There is, from a construction cost standpoint, leaving one wall standing does nothing, right? So from the construction cost standpoint, it does nothing. From a permitting standpoint, it also does nothing. And the reason is because, used to be that you could leave a wall and you would be grandfathered in with certain things, but in today's world, most of the cities have caught on, and they say if you leave one wall, I still consider it a new home, and therefore we're going to subject you to new home processes, and you're going to be held to all the new standards of the codes and everything. So it doesn't really help. Some people also say, should I leave one wall for tax reasons? Does that help me? And the answer with that is I have never seen that work. I have seen people try it, and I have seen them end up getting reassessed just as they would if it were a brand new house. So to answer your question, Dwight, unfortunately, it doesn't help as much as it used to leave one wall standing. By the way, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to put those in as well here. Nikki, how are we doing on time?
Oh, you're good. You still have 15 minutes, so you're fine.
Oh, good. Okay, great.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, so Lauren says, what would an estimate per square foot be to knock down a standard 2-car garage and rebuild the garage with an ADU on top of the garage? So the question is really, what's the cost per square foot for building garage down below on the first floor and an ADU up on top? And you're probably, garage itself is probably about $150 per foot, but then ADU is probably up around that. Again, so entry level in the beach area, as I mentioned, is like $400 a foot. You can build for $300, but it's very difficult and it's not predictable. So, it might be $150 for down below and $300 to $400 up above. But I have heard stories of people finding contractors that can build for less than that, but you just can't count on it. Most contractors are still pretty busy, even with what's happening today. And they haven't really lowered their construction costs, mostly because they can't, because their labor is still charging the same, and because their materials have not gone down. So I hope that answers your question here. That's all the questions I see here. There is one thing that I would be happy to show you. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to reshare this right here. So this is, that software that I was showing you earlier. What we actually do is we put people, and by the way, feel free to ask more questions. We still have a few minutes. But while I'm waiting for questions, this is actually a 3D software that we use to put together every single one of our projects. And this is the same software that we end up using in order to create the construction documents for the contractor. So it's all kind of seamless. So if we create stone here, it ends up being on the drawings for the contractor. And people can kind of walk through it just like a video game. So right now I'm controlling this on my keyboard, and we actually have VR goggles that we put on our clients' heads so that they can kind of walk around and see what the height of everything is going to feel like. We can actually change the sun direction. So you can see here, this is different types of the day. It's 2 p.m., and this here's 10 a.m. and everything. And you can kind of see how the sun will wash down on your home and how the materiality works and everything. So, and then, we also put the actual view on a second story so that people can see what it is that they're going to be looking at in any given second floor. So it's kind of fun that they can actually kind of walk through and see what everything is going to feel like by putting a set of VR goggles on. And we can put our actual clients in. No, I'm just kidding. We can't put our clients in. But what you can do is you can really start to get a feeling for what it's going to be like to be in any given location in your house. And then, of course, you can fly and kind of see what it'll be like from an aerial standpoint as well. So, name the software is one of the questions. So we use Revit. Revit is the what we use to build the model. So this is built in Revit. And this 3D rendering software is called Enscape. So we actually use them together. Enscape helps you with the rendering and the navigation, and the building part of it occurs with Revit, which is a common 3D building information management software. And Doug says, what is the typical cost per square foot range to remodel a kitchen for cabinets and countertops? So that one's really tough, because now you're getting into kind of the micro level, right? And then you start to kind of say, instead of saying per square foot, you kind of have to say per kitchen, right? So, a kitchen, if you're doing new kitchen here, this kitchen could cost anywhere, depending on what type of cabinets you put in, you really could spend very little on this kitchen. You could spend, $30,000 on this kitchen, $20,000 on this kitchen, but you could also spend $150,000 on this kitchen. And I've seen it happen every way. You know, when you're talking about the square footage of the whole house, it's easier to put per square foot costs on it. But then once you kind of get to that nitty gritty level, it's tough. And especially, you know, when you look at things like maybe you have, you know, these, you have, you know, kind of higher ceilings. And so you have to have more cabinetry, and again, different types and directions. So unfortunately, that one's a tougher question to answer without seeing specifically what we're talking about. All right, so that is pretty much the presentation. I see one more question here. Existing square footage, 1806, how much would it cost to add 1,200 square feet, second story addition? $300 or $400 per square foot, and would it be cheaper to tear it down and rebuild? Yes, this is the situation I was talking about before, where you're basically adding almost the same amount of square footage on top as down below. 1,200 square feet on top, you should probably look at tearing the house down and starting from scratch. It's not going to be $300 or $400 per foot. You're probably looking at $450 just for the top story, and then you have to recalculate the bottom story again at another $300 or $400 per foot. So I would say at that point, tear the house down and start from scratch. Let's see, bathroom remodel range of cost. So you can do a bathroom remodel for, you know, $10,000 for $5,000, and you can also do a bathroom remodel for $40,000. And again, it depends on the range of finish, the type of fixture. I mean, a toilet alone could be on the very cheap end, could be $150 to $300, and on the expensive end, the toilet itself could cost, you know, $1,500 or $2,000. And I've seen them for $5,000. They talk to you. It's fun. Sandy says, what is your firm charge for consultation? So it depends on the consultation, right? If it is a 1 hour consultation, then we charge for 1 hour of work. My rate is $345. My architects in the office range from $120 up to $185 per hour. So consultations, depending on if there's drawings necessary, then those drawings would be billed out at the lower rates. If it's a consultation to talk to, you know, to talk on site and for discussion and advice and everything, then it would be at my hourly rate. There is also flat fees for some pre-design services if we're figuring out what can be on a certain lot and it's involved, you know, for example, again, in Rancho Palo Verdes, where we have that lot coverage issue. To figure that out, we would flat fee that. And, you know, that can range from $1,500 to $3,000, depending on what it is that we're doing. So, and again, all that can be done very quickly during the escrow period. During the contingency period, hopefully, if your contingencies are a week or more, then that's usually enough time for us to come up with some answers for you. Okay, it looks like that's about it. Let's see. Oh, one more question. Are you exclusively home design or pool landscape as well? We do schematic landscape and hardscape for projects when we're designing a home or when we're doing a remodel and addition. But if it's just pool and landscape, then I would refer you to a landscape architect. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you having me. I wish I could see all of your shining faces here, but you know, short of that, I still enjoyed this. So they had great questions. Feel free to email me if you would like. I believe Nikki may have sent you my contact information, and you can feel free to email me if you have any questions or if you want to call for consultation or any follow-up, please feel free.
I think there's one more question, Joe.
Oh, do you know any pool design people? I do, and if you'd like to shoot me an email, I'd be more than happy to send that over to you.
And I'm going to put Joe's email in the chat for you guys. There you go. And thank you so much for being here today and presenting to us virtually. And this presentation will also be on our YouTube page if anybody needs to go back and take a look. And I just put Joe's email in the chat for you guys as well. And Joe will also be back doing another presentation for us. Do you have the date off the top of your head, Joe?
You know what? I don't have it.
It'll be on our calendar, though. I think it's coming up next month. So thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your week. Thank you so much, Joe.
Of course. Thank you. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.